The sound of a shattering plate cuts through the air. Before you consciously register what happened, your hand has already shot out, catching the falling object mere inches from the ground. For a split second, you feel detached from your own body, as if something else controlled your movements. This moment of disconnect is not an illusion. It represents one of the most profound and overlooked truths about human consciousness. Your brain makes decisions before you know about them. That reflexive catch happened approximately 150 milliseconds before your conscious mind became aware of the falling plate. In that quarter-second gap lies a neurological revelation that challenges our most fundamental assumptions about free will, identity, and the very nature of human consciousness. What if I told you that your reflexes are not merely protective mechanisms but windows into the hidden architecture of your mind? That these automatic responses reveal how consciousness itself is constructed, and that understanding the true nature of these reflexes might fundamentally change how you view yourself and your place in the universe. The story of reflexes begins not with humans, but with a frog. In 1780, Italian physician Luigi Galvani noticed something peculiar while dissecting frog legs in his laboratory. When his metal scalpel accidentally touched a nearby electrical conductor during a lightning storm, the dead frog's muscles twitched violently. This accidental discovery opened the door to understanding that animal tissues respond to electrical stimulation, a finding that would eventually reveal the electrochemical nature of our nervous system. What Galvani could not have known was that his simple observation would ultimately lead to questioning the very nature of human consciousness. His contemporary scientists dismissed his findings as mere animal electricity, something fundamentally different from human thought and action. They believed humans possessed something special, a soul, consciousness, or free will that animals lacked. The twitching frog legs were just mechanical responses, while human actions were guided by conscious intention. But were they right? Dr. Cynthia Keller, a modern neuroscientist at Stanford University, has spent 20 years studying the gap between reflexive action and conscious awareness. What's fascinating, she explains, is that the more we investigate, the more we realize that the boundary between reflexive and conscious actions is not just blurry. It may be entirely constructed by our perception rather than reflecting biological reality. To understand why this matters, we need to journey deeper into the nervous system itself. The questions we'll explore challenge our most basic assumptions. Who is in control of your movements? Is consciousness the driver of your actions or merely a passenger along for the ride? And if many of our actions begin before we're aware of them, what does that tell us about the nature of free will? The journey into this mystery begins with a simple question. What happens in your body when you touch something hot? Your hand rests on a hot stove. Before your conscious mind registers pain, your arm has already jerked away. This happens because sensory neurons in your fingertips detect dangerous heat and send signals racing up afferent nerves to your spinal cord at speeds exceeding 250 miles per hour. When these signals reach your spinal cord, they trigger an immediate response. Motor neurons fire, contracting muscles that pull your hand away, all before the pain signal even reaches your brain. This circuit, from stimulus to response without conscious processing, is called a reflex arc. It evolved as a survival mechanism, bypassing the relatively slow process of conscious decision-making to protect the body from immediate harm. Reflexes were among the first neural circuits to evolve in complex animals, explains Dr. Xavier Ellington, evolutionary neurobiologist at Cambridge. Even the simplest vertebrates possess them because they solve an essential problem: how to respond to threats faster than predators can strike. The elegance of this system becomes apparent when we examine the timing. A reflex response takes approximately 50 milliseconds, 0.05 seconds. By comparison, conscious recognition of danger takes between 200 to 300 milliseconds. In evolutionary terms, those extra milliseconds could mean the difference between life and death. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Modern neuroscience has discovered that this same principle, neural decisions preceding conscious awareness, applies to actions we firmly believe arise from conscious choice. In 1983, neurophysiologist Benjamin Libet conducted a revolutionary experiment. He asked participants to flex their wrists whenever they felt the urge to do so, while he measured their brain activity using an electroencephalogram, e.g. Participants also noted the exact moment they decided to move by watching a special clock. The results shocked the scientific community. Libet discovered that a distinctive brain wave pattern called the readiness potential appeared approximately 350 milliseconds before participants reported deciding to move. In other words, their brains began preparing for movement before they were consciously aware of deciding to move. This discovery sent shockwaves through neuroscience, philosophy, and ethics. If our brains decide before we consciously choose, what does this tell us about free will? Are our conscious choices merely post hoc stories we tell ourselves about decisions already made by unconscious processes? Dr. Cynthia Keller explains the implications. Libet's experiment suggests that consciousness might not be initiating our actions, but rather becoming aware of actions already set in motion by unconscious processes. This doesn't necessarily eliminate free will, but it certainly transforms how we understand it. The experiment has been replicated and extended numerous times with increasingly sophisticated technology. In 2008, researchers at the Max Planck Institute used functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, to show that they could predict which button a person would press up to 7 seconds before the person felt they had made a decision. 7 seconds of neural activity before conscious awareness. Let that sink in. To appreciate the magnitude of this gap, consider that in 7 seconds, light travels 1.3 million miles, more than 5 times the distance to the moon. Yet in your brain, neural activity preparing for what feels like a spontaneous decision occurs that far ahead of your awareness. But if unconscious processes initiate our actions before we're aware of them, who or what is making these decisions? And what role does consciousness play if not the role of prime mover? To answer these questions, we need to dive deeper into the architecture of your brain and examine a special class of neurons that form the bridge between what we think of as reflexive and voluntary actions. In the depths of your brain lies a peculiar type of cell discovered relatively recently. In 1992, neuroscientist Giacomo Rizzolatti and his team at the University of Parma in Italy were studying motor neurons in macaque monkeys. These scientists were recording the activity of specific neurons that fired when the monkey performed particular actions, like grasping food. Then something unexpected happened. A researcher entered the lab with an ice cream cone, and as he raised it to his mouth, the same neurons in the observing monkey fired as if the monkey itself were grasping the ice cream, even though the monkey remained perfectly still. The team had discovered mirror neurons, cells that activate both when an animal performs an action and when it observes the same action performed by another. This finding revolutionized our understanding of how brains process and interpret behavior. Mirror neurons represent a neurological mechanism that blurs the line between self and other, explains Dr. Xavier Ellington. They're essential for empathy, learning through imitation, and understanding the intentions behind others' actions. But mirror neurons also reveal something profound about the relationship between reflexes and conscious actions. When you see someone get hurt, you might wince involuntarily. Your mirror neurons fire in response to their pain, creating a rudimentary form of empathy that occurs before conscious processing. This automatic mirroring suggests that the boundary between reflexive responses and intentional actions isn't as clear as we once believed. Instead, there appears to be a continuum, with pure reflexes on one end and deliberative thought on the other, with most of our behavior falling somewhere in between. Consider the startle response. When you hear a sudden loud noise, you instinctively flinch. This response is mediated by a neural pathway involving the brainstem, specifically the pontine reticular formation, that triggers within 20 milliseconds of the stimulus. It's one of our most primitive reflexes, shared with virtually all mammals. But unlike simpler reflexes, the startle response can be modified by your emotional state. If you're already anxious, your startle response will be more pronounced. This modulation involves the amygdala, a brain structure central to emotional processing. The amygdala can amplify or dampen reflexive responses based on context and emotional state. This interaction between reflex and emotion reveals another layer of complexity. What we consider purely automatic responses are actually influenced by our emotional states and past experiences, factors we typically associate with higher consciousness. Dr. Cynthia Keller's research takes this further. What we're discovering is that reflexes aren't isolated circuits but are integrated within broader networks involving emotion, memory, and even social cognition. The spinal reflex that jerks your hand from a hot stove is relatively simple, but most reflexive behaviors involve multiple brain regions working in concert. This integration is particularly evident in what neuroscientists call prepared responses, actions that fall between pure reflexes and deliberate decisions. These are behaviors we've rehearsed so thoroughly that they've become automatic, like an experienced driver braking when a traffic light turns red, or a trained musician playing a familiar piece without consciously thinking about each note. In 2012, a team at Johns Hopkins University used real-time brain imaging to study concert pianists. As these musicians played memorized pieces, the researchers observed decreased activity in their prefrontal cortex, the brain region associated with conscious decision-making, and increased activity in motor regions and the cerebellum, which coordinates complex movements. The pianists weren't consciously deciding which keys to press moment by moment. Their highly trained neural circuits were executing complex sequences automatically, with consciousness seemingly along for the ride rather than driving the performance. But if expert performances operate largely outside consciousness, what exactly is consciousness doing? If actions from basic reflexes to complex skilled behaviors can occur with minimal conscious input, what purpose does conscious awareness serve? To answer this question, we need to examine an extraordinary case that illuminates the relationship between consciousness and reflexive action, the remarkable phenomenon of blind sight. In 1974, a 27-year-old man known in medical literature as Patient DB suffered damage to his primary visual cortex due to a stroke. He became clinically blind in his right visual field, a condition called hemianopia. When shown objects in his blind field, DB insisted he could not see them. But researchers noticed something peculiar. When asked to guess where objects were located in his blind field, DB could point to them with surprising accuracy, despite having no conscious awareness of seeing them. This phenomenon, dubbed blind sight by neuropsychologist Lawrence Weisskranz, demonstrates a profound dissociation between conscious visual experience and visually guided action. DB could respond to visual information without consciously perceiving it. Blind sight reveals an essential truth about brain function. There are multiple pathways processing sensory information simultaneously, and not all of them contribute to conscious experience. In the case of vision, the primary pathway runs from the retina through the lateral geniculate nucleus to the primary visual cortex, creating conscious visual perception. But there's also an older, secondary pathway that routes visual information through the superior colliculus and pulvinar to the brain's action centers. This second pathway can guide behavior without generating conscious visual experience. Blind sight is perhaps the most dramatic demonstration that our actions can be guided by information we don't consciously perceive, explains Dr. Xavier Ellington. It suggests that consciousness represents only a fraction of the brain's processing, the tip of a neural iceberg, with vast information processing occurring beneath awareness. Similar dissociations between conscious awareness and behavior appear in other sensory domains. In a condition called deaf hearing, individuals with damage to auditory cortex report hearing nothing, yet show physiological responses to sounds. Their brains process auditory information without generating conscious auditory experiences. These neurological conditions point to a profound possibility. Perhaps consciousness isn't primarily about controlling behavior but rather about monitoring and modulating it. Consciousness might be more of an observer and occasional editor rather than the author of our actions. Consider the experience of catching a baseball. The calculations required to position your hand at exactly the right spot to intercept a ball traveling in an arc are mathematically complex, involving differential equations that would challenge sophisticated computers. Yet children perform these calculations effortlessly, without any conscious awareness of the underlying mathematics. How is this possible? Your brain contains specialized visual processing regions that track moving objects and predict their trajectories. These regions connect directly to motor centers controlling arm movement. This system operates largely outside consciousness, with conscious attention serving primarily to initiate the process and monitor the results. When you catch a ball, says Dr. Cynthia Keller, your conscious mind isn't micromanaging the millions of calculations and muscle contractions involved. Instead, consciousness sets the goal, catch that ball, and then specialized neural circuits handle the details automatically. This relationship between conscious goals and unconscious execution appears throughout human behavior. When you decide to walk across a room, you consciously set the destination, but the complex sequence of muscle contractions that propel you there occurs without conscious oversight. In 2019, researchers at University College London used high-density EEG recordings to track the flow of neural information during simple voluntary actions. They found that conscious intention activated specific frontal lobe regions, which then triggered cascades of activity through motor planning areas and finally to the motor cortex controlling movement. Once initiated, these cascades proceeded automatically, with conscious attention returning only if something unexpected occurred. This finding suggests a new model for understanding consciousness and its relationship to reflexes. Rather than viewing reflexes and conscious actions as fundamentally different processes, we might better understand them as points on a continuum defined by the degree of conscious monitoring and intervention. Pure reflexes like the knee-jerk response involve no conscious oversight. Semi-automatic behaviors like walking or driving a familiar route involve conscious initiation and occasional monitoring. Novel, complex actions require constant conscious attention. But crucially, all these behaviors rely on the same fundamental neural mechanisms. This model has profound implications for how we understand human behavior and its relationship to consciousness. It suggests that much of what we consider voluntary action actually operates through the same mechanisms as reflexes, differing primarily in the degree of conscious oversight involved. But this raises a puzzling question. If our sophisticated conscious minds evolved from simpler reflex systems, why did consciousness evolve at all? What advantages does consciousness provide that couldn't be achieved through increasingly sophisticated but non-conscious reflexes? To answer this question, we need to examine the evolutionary history of reflexes and the selective pressures that might have favored the emergence of consciousness. Approximately 550 million years ago, during the Cambrian explosion, animal life diversified explosively. Among the evolutionary innovations that emerged during this period were the first complex nervous systems. The earliest reflexes evolved in simple marine creatures that needed to respond to their environment but lacked centralized brains. Sea anemones, which have existed for over 500 million years, possess a simple nerve net that allows them to contract when touched, a primitive reflex that protects them from predators. As animals became more complex, so did their reflexive behaviors. The development of bilateral symmetry and centralized nerve cords in early worm-like creatures around 520 million years ago enabled more sophisticated responses. These animals could move away from harmful stimuli rather than simply contracting. The evolution of vertebrates approximately 500 million years ago marked another significant advance. The development of a protected spinal cord and brain allowed for increasingly complex reflex circuits and the hierarchical organization of the nervous system. What we see throughout evolutionary history, explains Dr. Xavier Ellington, is a progressive layering of neural systems. Rather than replacing earlier mechanisms, evolution tends to build new systems on top of existing ones. Our most advanced cognitive abilities rest upon ancient reflex circuits that have been conserved for hundreds of millions of years. This evolutionary perspective helps explain why our nervous systems contain both lightning-fast reflex arcs and slower conscious processing. Each system evolved to address different challenges. Reflexes provide immediate responses to immediate dangers, while consciousness allows for planning, learning, and adapting to novel situations. But consciousness offers something else that pure reflexes cannot: behavioral flexibility. While reflexes provide fixed responses to specific stimuli, consciousness allows us to inhibit reflexive responses when appropriate and generate novel behaviors in unprecedented situations. Consider a tennis player returning a serve. At the professional level, the ball can travel at speeds exceeding 150 miles per hour, leaving less than 500 milliseconds for the returner to react. This is too fast for completely conscious control of movement. Instead, professional players rely on highly trained reflexive responses. Yet consciousness plays a crucial role. Before the serve, the player consciously anticipates possible trajectories based on the server's positioning and previous patterns. This presets motor programs, priming certain reflexes while inhibiting others. After the return, conscious evaluation helps refine responses for future points. This interplay between reflexive action and conscious oversight represents a key evolutionary advantage. Pure reflexes, while fast, are inflexible. Pure consciousness, while flexible, would be too slow for many survival-critical situations. The integration of both systems provides speed when needed and adaptability when possible. Dr. Cynthia Keller elaborates, "Consciousness appears to have evolved not to replace reflexes but to orchestrate them, to decide which reflexive behaviors to express, which to suppress, and when to generate entirely novel responses. This orchestration is particularly evident in the phenomenon of habit formation. When you learn a new skill, like driving a car, you initially require intense conscious concentration for each action. Over time, these actions become increasingly automatic, requiring less conscious oversight. This transition from conscious to automatic processing involves a shift in brain activity from the prefrontal cortex to the basal ganglia, brain structures involved in action selection and habit formation. As behaviors become habitual, they become more reflex-like, freeing consciousness to focus on other tasks. In 2005, neuroscientists at MIT discovered specialized neurons in the striatum, part of the basal ganglia, that fire at the beginning and end of habitual action sequences but remain quiet during the sequence itself. These bracketing neurons appear to mark the boundaries of automatic behavioral chunks, allowing consciousness to initiate a complex sequence and then disengage until the sequence completes. This mechanism explains how you can drive home on a familiar route while thinking about something else entirely, then come back to awareness when you arrive. Your conscious mind initiated the familiar drive sequence, then disengaged to focus on other thoughts while habitual processes guided your driving, with consciousness returning when the sequence completed. But this raises a profound question. If many of our apparently voluntary actions operate through mechanisms similar to reflexes, with consciousness merely initiating sequences and monitoring results, what implications does this have for our understanding of free will and personal responsibility? The relationship between reflexes, habits, and conscious choice leads us to one of the most challenging questions in neuroscience. What does the architecture of our nervous system tell us about the nature of human freedom? At 10:30 a.m. on August 1, 1966, Charles Whitman climbed to the observation deck of the University of Texas Tower and began shooting at people below, killing 16 and wounding 31 others before police shot him dead. In a suicide note, Whitman requested an autopsy to determine if something in his brain had caused his violent impulses. He wrote that he had been experiencing severe headaches and intrusive violent thoughts that he could not explain. The autopsy revealed a glioblastoma tumor pressing against his amygdala, a brain structure crucial for processing fear and aggression. While this discovery doesn't excuse Whitman's actions, it raises profound questions about the relationship between brain function and behavior. To what extent was Whitman's violence influenced by the tumor disrupting his normal brain function? Cases like Whitman's highlight the complex relationship between neurological function and human behavior. They force us to confront difficult questions about responsibility in a world where our actions emerge from neural processes that operate largely outside our conscious awareness. The more we understand about the neuroscience of behavior, says Dr. Cynthia Keller, the more we recognize that the traditional concept of free will, as conscious decisions uncaused by prior physical events, is difficult to reconcile with how brains actually work. But this doesn't mean we lack agency or responsibility. It means we need a more nuanced understanding of what freedom means in the context of embodied creatures with layered nervous systems. This more nuanced understanding begins with recognizing that freedom exists on a spectrum. A pure reflex like pulling your hand from a hot surface involves minimal freedom. It's an automatic response to a stimulus. At the other extreme, carefully deliberated decisions made with full awareness of alternatives involve maximal freedom. Most human actions fall somewhere between these extremes. They emerge from the interaction between reflexive circuits, habitual patterns, emotional states, and conscious deliberation. Our freedom doesn't consist in being uncaused by our neural architecture, but in having neural architecture sophisticated enough to incorporate reflection, deliberation, and learning into our decision-making processes. In 2008, neuroscientists at Stanford developed an influential model called the Readiness, Reflection, and Response Framework for Understanding Human Choice. In this model, unconscious neural processes, the readiness phase, prepare multiple possible actions based on environmental cues and past experiences. Consciousness, the reflection phase, then evaluates these possibilities, potentially vetoing some options and strengthening others before action execution, the response phase. This model preserves meaningful human freedom while acknowledging that our choices emerge from complex neural processes that begin before conscious awareness. Freedom, in this view, doesn't require being uncaused but rather involves the capacity for reflective self-regulation, the ability to evaluate potential actions against our values and modify our behavior accordingly. What makes humans distinct, explains Dr. Xavier Ellington, isn't that we lack reflexive or automatic behaviors. We have plenty of those. What's distinctive is our capacity to recognize our automatic patterns and gradually reshape them through conscious intervention. Consider the case of addiction. Substance addiction involves the hijacking of reward circuits, creating powerful automatic behaviors that persist despite negative consequences. Yet people can and do overcome addiction through various forms of therapy and self-help programs. These recovery processes work not by eliminating automatic neural responses but by strengthening competing neural pathways through conscious practice. Over time, new habits replace old ones, demonstrating how consciousness can gradually reshape even deeply ingrained automatic behaviors. This relationship between automatic processes and conscious oversight has profound implications for personal development. It suggests that meaningful change doesn't come from directly controlling each action through conscious will, but rather from systematically training automatic processes to better align with consciously chosen values. This insight connects modern neuroscience with ancient philosophical traditions. Aristotle's concept of virtue as habituated excellence, becoming good by practicing good actions until they become second nature, aligns remarkably well with our current understanding of how conscious practice reshapes neural circuits to create new automatic behaviors. The relationship between reflexes and consciousness also illuminates mental health conditions. Obsessive-compulsive disorder, for instance, involves excessive activity in brain circuits connecting the orbitofrontal cortex and basal ganglia, creating intrusive thoughts and compulsive behaviors that feel reflexive and difficult to control. Effective treatments like exposure and response prevention therapy work by gradually strengthening conscious control over these reflexive responses. Through repeated practice, patients learn to tolerate anxiety without performing compulsive behaviors, gradually reshaping the underlying neural circuits. This therapeutic approach exemplifies how understanding the relationship between reflexes and conscious control can lead to more effective interventions for psychological difficulties. By recognizing that many problematic behaviors involve disordered automatic processes rather than conscious choices, we can develop treatments that address the appropriate level of neural function. But perhaps the most profound implication of understanding reflexes and their relationship to consciousness concerns how we view ourselves and others. If many of our actions emerge from processes operating outside conscious awareness, this suggests the need for greater compassion, both for ourselves when we fail to live up to our ideals and for others whose behaviors we might too quickly judge. This doesn't mean abandoning responsibility or accountability. Rather, it means recognizing that changing behavior, whether our own or others, requires more than simply deciding to change. It requires systematic practices that gradually reshape the automatic processes from which our actions emerge. As we explore this relationship between reflexive and conscious processes further, we discover something even more fundamental about the nature of consciousness itself, something that might transform how we understand our place in the universe. In 2005, neurologist Marcus Raichle published a landmark paper identifying what he called the default mode network, DMN, a set of interconnected brain regions that become active when we're not focused on the external world. This network, which includes parts of the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and lateral parietal cortex, activates when our minds wander or when we reflect on ourselves and our relationships with others. The discovery of the DMN revealed something surprising. Our brains consume nearly as much energy during rest as during focused tasks. The difference lies not in how much energy is used but in which neural systems are active. This finding challenged the traditional view of the brain as primarily a reactive organ responding to external stimuli. Instead, it suggested that the brain is constantly active, generating predictions about the world and the consequences of potential actions. Modern neuroscience has largely abandoned the stimulus-response model that dominated early reflex research in favor of what's called the predictive processing framework. In this view, the brain continuously generates predictions about incoming sensory information based on internal models of the world. Sensory inputs are compared against these predictions, with mismatches generating error signals that update the internal models. What we're discovering, explains Dr. Cynthia Keller, is that perception itself works more like a reflex than we previously thought. Rather than passively recording sensory information, our brains actively construct perceptual experiences by combining sensory inputs with prior expectations. This predictive framework helps explain many puzzling aspects of perception, including optical illusions, where our brain's predictions override actual sensory data. It also explains how we can function in noisy environments by filling in missing information based on context and previous experience. But the most profound implication of the predictive processing framework concerns consciousness itself. If our perceptual experiences are constructed rather than received, built from the interaction between sensory inputs and prior expectations, then consciousness may be fundamentally creative rather than receptive. This idea was vividly demonstrated in a 2020 study at the University of California, San Francisco. Researchers used brain imaging to identify patterns of neural activity associated with specific visual perceptions, then used machine learning to decode what participants were seeing based solely on their brain activity. The surprising finding was that similar neural patterns appeared not only when participants viewed actual images but also when they merely imagined those images. The neural signatures of perception and imagination overlapped substantially, suggesting that seeing and imagining involve many of the same neural processes. This tells us something profound about consciousness, says Dr. Xavier Ellington. Rather than being a passive receiver of information, consciousness actively constructs our experience of the world. Perception is more like controlled hallucination than faithful recording. This constructive view of consciousness reconnects with our understanding of reflexes in an unexpected way. Just as reflexes involve automatic responses to environmental stimuli, consciousness involves automatic constructions of perceptual experiences based on incoming sensory data. The difference is that conscious constructions are vastly more complex, integrating information across multiple sensory modalities, memory systems, and predictive models. But both reflexes and conscious experiences share a fundamental characteristic. They emerge from processes that operate largely outside awareness. This perspective suggests that consciousness itself might be understood as an evolved capacity for increasingly sophisticated predictive modeling. Simple organisms possess simple reflexes, fixed responses to specific stimuli. More complex organisms develop more flexible responses based on learning and prediction. Consciousness, in this view, represents the most sophisticated predictive system yet evolved, one capable of modeling not only the external world but also itself. What makes human consciousness distinctive, explains Dr. Cynthia Keller, is not that it operates on fundamentally different principles than other neural systems, but that it incorporates higher-order representations. We don't just model the world, we model our own modeling of the world. This recursive capacity for self-modeling appears to be central to human consciousness. It allows us to reflect on our own thoughts, to imagine how others perceive us, and to project ourselves into hypothetical futures. Recent research supports this connection between self-modeling and consciousness. In 2018, neuroscientists at University College London identified neural signatures associated with conscious awareness by comparing brain activity during seen versus unseen visual stimuli. The key difference wasn't in sensory processing regions, but in how information propagated to regions associated with self-representation and metacognition, thinking about thinking. This suggests that what makes an experience conscious is not the sensory processing itself, but rather the integration of that processing into higher-order models of one's own mental states. We become conscious of perceptions when they become part of our self-model. If consciousness emerges from this capacity for sophisticated self-modeling, this helps explain the intimate connection between consciousness and learning. Learning involves updating predictive models based on experience, and consciousness appears optimally designed to facilitate this process. Consider what happens when you encounter something unexpected. Your brain's prediction error signals capture your attention, making you consciously aware of the mismatch between expectation and reality. This conscious awareness allows for more sophisticated learning than would be possible through simple associative mechanisms. Dr. Xavier Ellington elaborates, consciousness seems particularly important for learning from rare or complex events. When patterns are simple and repeated often, unconscious learning systems work effectively. But for extracting meaning from complex, infrequent experiences, consciousness offers significant advantages. This relationship between consciousness and complex learning brings us back to reflexes. From this perspective, reflexes represent evolutionarily older, simpler predictive systems optimized for speed and reliability in specific situations. Consciousness represents a newer, more flexible predictive system optimized for learning and adaptation in complex, changing environments. Rather than being fundamentally different processes, reflexes and conscious deliberation may represent different points on a continuum of predictive systems, varying in complexity, flexibility, and awareness of their own operations. This unified view of neural function, from simple reflexes to complex consciousness, offers a more coherent understanding of human experience than traditional dualistic models that sharply separate automatic from voluntary processes. It suggests that all our behaviors emerge from the same fundamental neural architecture, with differences in degree rather than kind. But perhaps the most profound implication of this perspective is what it suggests about our relationship with our own minds. If consciousness itself is largely a constructed experience rather than direct access to reality, this invites a radical reconsideration of what it means to know ourselves. Alexandra was 7 years old when the seizures began. Initially diagnosed with childhood epilepsy, her condition proved resistant to standard treatments. As the seizures intensified, her medical team at Boston Children's Hospital made a difficult decision: a corpus callosotomy, a procedure that severs the connection between the brain's left and right hemispheres. The surgery successfully reduced Alexandra's seizures, but her doctors noticed something unexpected during her recovery. When objects were presented exclusively to her left visual field, processed by her right hemisphere, Alexandra would claim not to see them. Yet she could accurately reach for these unseen objects with her left hand, which is also controlled by the right hemisphere. Alexandra had developed what neurologists call alien hand syndrome. Her left hand would sometimes act independently of her conscious intentions, reaching for objects or even undoing buttons her right hand had just fastened. Most remarkably, when asked why her left hand was moving, Alexandra would confabulate explanations, creating plausible but entirely fictional reasons for actions she hadn't consciously initiated. Cases like Alexandra's reveal something profound about consciousness. When denied access to the actual causes of our actions, our conscious minds readily invent explanations that maintain the illusion of unified, intentional control. This tendency for confabulation isn't limited to rare neurological conditions. In a famous series of experiments during the 1970s, social psychologist Timothy Wilson demonstrated that people routinely confabulate explanations for their choices without realizing they're doing so. In one experiment, participants were asked to evaluate pairs of identical pantyhose and select which they preferred. While participants provided elaborate justifications for their choices, citing supposedly superior texture or sheerness, the actual determining factor was simply the position of the items on the display. Items on the right were chosen more frequently, yet no participant mentioned position as influencing their decision. What these studies reveal, explains Dr. Cynthia Keller, is that our conscious awareness doesn't have direct access to many of the processes that influence our behavior. Instead, consciousness often works backward, observing our actions and constructing narratives to explain them. Narratives we fully believe despite their sometimes tenuous relationship with reality. This insight helps explain the puzzling results of Libet's experiments on the timing of conscious decisions. Perhaps the readiness potential that precedes conscious awareness of intention doesn't indicate that consciousness is epiphenomenal, a mere passive observer of predetermined actions. Instead, it might reveal that the sense of conscious intention itself is part of the brain's narrative constructing process. Our sense of agency, the feeling that I am causing my actions, may be a useful fiction created by our brains to maintain a coherent self-model rather than an accurate representation of how decisions actually emerge from distributed neural processes. Dr. Xavier Ellington draws an illuminating analogy. Consider how you experience a movie. You perceive continuous motion, but in reality, you're viewing a series of static images presented in rapid succession. The motion you experience is constructed by your brain. Similarly, the sense of being a unified conscious agent making decisions may be a construction that simplifies the immensely complex distributed processing actually occurring in your brain. This doesn't mean that consciousness is unimportant or that our sense of agency is meaningless. On the contrary, this constructed sense of unified agency serves crucial functions. It allows us to maintain coherent self-models, learn from experience, and coordinate complex behaviors toward long-term goals. From this perspective, consciousness might be understood as a simplified user interface that provides functional access to incredibly complex neural processes without requiring awareness of all the details, similar to how a computer's graphical interface provides functional access to underlying computational processes without requiring users to understand machine code. This view helps resolve the apparent paradox revealed by studies of reflexes and readiness potentials. Yes, many actions are initiated before conscious awareness, but consciousness still influences behavior by shaping the context in which these actions occur and by evaluating their outcomes for future learning. Dr. Cynthia Keller elaborates, consciousness might not initiate each individual action, but it creates the frameworks within which automatic processes operate. Through attention, reflection, and deliberate practice, consciousness gradually reshapes the unconscious processes from which most actions emerge. This relationship between conscious and unconscious processes is evident in how experts develop their skills. A concert pianist doesn't consciously control each individual finger movement when performing. Instead, through years of practice, They develop highly refined automatic processes that execute complex sequences without conscious oversight. The pianist's consciousness focuses on higher-level aspects of the performance, emotional expression, responding to audience energy, or communicating with other musicians. This represents a division of cognitive labor, with consciousness handling novel, complex, or socially relevant aspects while automatic processes handle well-practiced technical elements. This division of labor appears throughout human behavior. When you drive a familiar route, automatic processes handle the mechanics of driving while consciousness might plan your day or engage with a podcast. When you converse with friends, automatic language production systems generate grammatically correct sentences while consciousness focuses on the conceptual content and social dynamics. Rather than seeing this automaticity as challenging human freedom, we might recognize it as enabling more sophisticated forms of freedom. By delegating routine aspects of behavior to automatic processes, consciousness is freed to engage with novel challenges and higher-order concerns. The relationship between reflexes and consciousness isn't adversarial but complementary, explains Dr. Xavier Ellington. Our most sophisticated achievements depend on both systems working together. Reflexive processes providing speed and efficiency, conscious processes providing flexibility and innovation. This complementary relationship is particularly evident in states of flow, the optimal performance state described by psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, where people report being fully immersed in an activity with a seemingly effortless integration of action and awareness. Brain imaging studies of people in flow states reveal decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex alongside increased connectivity between sensory, motor, and reward systems. This pattern suggests that flow involves the temporary suspension of certain aspects of self-conscious control, allowing well-trained automatic processes to operate with minimal interference. The paradox of flow is that this state of reduced conscious control often produces our most skillful performances. The expert athlete or musician performing in the zone achieves feats that would be impossible through deliberate, conscious control of each movement. This observation brings us back to the central insight emerging from our exploration of reflexes. The relationship between automatic and conscious processes isn't a simple hierarchy with consciousness in charge. Rather, it's a dynamic partnership where optimal functioning often involves knowing when to assert conscious control and when to trust automatic processes. Understanding this relationship transforms how we might approach personal development and skill acquisition. Instead of trying to maintain constant conscious control over our actions, we might focus on systematically training automatic processes through deliberate practice, then learning to trust these processes in performance situations. This perspective also invites a reconsideration of traditional philosophical concepts like freedom and authenticity. Perhaps freedom isn't about escaping deterministic processes but about aligning automatic processes with consciously chosen values through systematic practice. Perhaps authenticity isn't about acting from pure conscious intention but about developing automatic processes that faithfully express our deepest values without requiring constant conscious oversight. As we integrate these insights, a new understanding of the relationship between reflexes and consciousness emerges, one that might fundamentally transform how we understand ourselves and our place in the universe. Consider this: you are not a single unified agent making decisions in real time. You are a community of processes, some ancient and reflexive, others modern and reflective, working in concert to navigate a complex world. This perspective doesn't diminish human uniqueness or dignity. Rather, it enriches our self-understanding by revealing the magnificent complexity of what we too casually call I. The conscious self emerges from the integration of multiple processing streams, each with its own evolutionary history and specialized functions. The more we learn about the brain, explains Dr. Cynthia Keller, the more we recognize that consciousness isn't a single thing but a complex, layered process integrating information across multiple timescales and processing systems. What we experience as a unified self is actually a remarkable achievement of neural integration. This integration isn't perfect. The alien hand syndrome experienced by split-brain patients like Alexandra reveals that the unified self can fracture when the brain's integration mechanisms are compromised. Even in neurologically typical individuals, the different systems don't always align, as when we reflexively reach for a cookie while consciously maintaining a commitment to healthier eating. Yet what's remarkable isn't that these conflicts occur, but that they occur so rarely. Most of the time, our various neural systems work together seamlessly enough that we experience ourselves as unified agents rather than collections of semi-independent processes. This seamless integration depends on mechanisms that have evolved over hundreds of millions of years. The hierarchical organization of our nervous systems, from spinal reflexes to brainstem responses to cortical deliberation, represents an elegant solution to the problem of coordinating behavior across multiple timescales and complexity levels. Dr. Xavier Ellington draws a revealing comparison. The relationship between reflexes and consciousness parallels the relationship between workers and executives in a well-functioning organization. Reflexes handle routine operations with speed and efficiency, freeing consciousness to focus on strategy, innovation, and crisis management. This organizational metaphor helps explain why consciousness seems to become more active when we encounter novel situations or unexpected outcomes. Just as executives become more involved when business operations deviate from normal patterns, consciousness becomes more engaged when automatic processes encounter situations for which they're not optimized. This relationship is evident in learning processes. When acquiring a new skill, we initially require intense conscious focus on details. As we practice, performance gradually shifts from conscious control to automatic execution. This shift from explicit to implicit processing allows for greater speed and efficiency while freeing conscious resources for higher-order concerns. The gradual automation of well-practiced behaviors represents a sophisticated form of neural efficiency. Rather than requiring precious conscious resources for routine tasks, the brain develops specialized circuits that can execute these tasks automatically, reserving consciousness for situations where its flexibility and integrative capacity provide the greatest advantage. This efficiency principle helps explain why consciousness has limited capacity compared to unconscious processing. Consciousness appears to be a limited resource precisely because it's specialized for particularly complex integration tasks rather than routine processing. Recent research supports this specialization hypothesis. In 2021, neuroscientists at the Princeton Neuroscience Institute used high-density EEG and machine learning to identify neural signatures of conscious versus unconscious processing during problem-solving tasks. They found that conscious processing was characterized by global integration of information across distributed brain regions, while unconscious processing showed more localized activity patterns. This finding aligns with leading theories of consciousness like the global workspace theory proposed by Bernard Bars and the integrated information theory developed by Giulio Tononi. Both theories, despite their differences, suggest that consciousness emerges from the brain's capacity to integrate information across specialized processing systems. From this perspective, consciousness represents the brain's solution to the integration problem, how to coordinate specialized systems with different processing characteristics and evolutionary histories into coherent behavior aligned with the organism's overall needs and goals. Dr. Cynthia Keller elaborates, "What makes human consciousness distinctive isn't that it operates on fundamentally different principles than other neural systems, but that it integrates information at unprecedented levels of complexity, allowing us to coordinate behavior across multiple timescales from milliseconds to decades. This integrative capacity explains why consciousness seems particularly important for activities involving long-term planning, social coordination, and cultural learning. These activities require integrating information across vastly different domains and timescales in ways that would be difficult or impossible through simpler associative mechanisms. Consider the difference between reflexively withdrawing from pain and deliberately enduring pain for a greater purpose. Like an athlete continuing despite injury to win a championship or a parent enduring discomfort to care for a child. This capacity to override immediate reflexive responses in service of abstract goals or values represents a quintessentially human form of behavioral flexibility. This flexibility doesn't result from consciousness operating outside physical causation, but from the extraordinary integrative capacity of conscious processing. Consciousness can incorporate information about distant futures, abstract values, social expectations, and personal narratives into decision-making processes that would otherwise be dominated by immediate stimuli and reflexive responses. Dr. Xavier Ellington summarizes this perspective. Consciousness doesn't replace reflexes. It contextualizes them. It embeds reflexive responses within broader frameworks of meaning and value, allowing for behaviors guided by considerations beyond immediate stimulus-response relationships. This contextualizing function helps explain why consciousness often seems concerned with narrative and meaning-making. By constructing narratives that connect past experiences, present situations, and anticipated futures, consciousness creates contexts within which reflexive responses can be evaluated and modulated. The human capacity for narrative thinking allows us to experience our lives not as series of disconnected reflexive responses, but as meaningful journeys with coherent trajectories. This narrative integration provides a framework for evaluating automatic behaviors against longer-term goals and values, enabling forms of self-regulation impossible through simpler mechanisms. But perhaps the most profound implication of understanding the relationship between reflexes and consciousness concerns how we relate to ourselves and others. If our behaviors emerge from the interaction of multiple neural systems rather than from a single unified agent, this invites greater compassion for the internal conflicts and inconsistencies we all experience. It suggests that personal development involves not forcing a singular conscious will upon resistant automatic systems, but rather gradually aligning these systems through consistent practice informed by conscious values. It means recognizing that changing habits requires more than momentary conscious intention. It requires systematic reshaping of automatic processes through repeated action. This perspective also invites greater curiosity about the multiple streams of processing occurring within us at any moment. Rather than identifying exclusively with conscious thoughts, we might recognize the wisdom sometimes embedded in automatic responses and emotional reactions, which often incorporate information not available to conscious awareness. In this more integrated relationship with ourselves, consciousness becomes less a dictator imposing its will on automatic processes, and more a wise conductor coordinating the complex symphony of neural systems that collectively constitute what we call self. You walk along a forest path as sunset approaches. Without conscious thought, your eyes adjust to the dimming light, your pupils dilating to capture more of the fading illumination. Your feet navigate the uneven terrain automatically, making thousands of micro-adjustments to maintain balance. Your heart rate and breathing synchronize with your pace without any conscious direction. As darkness deepens, you hear a sudden rustling in the underbrush beside you. Before you've consciously registered the sound, your body has already responded. Muscles tensing, heart rate increasing, attention focusing on the potential threat. This ancient startle response, shared with countless other mammals, prepares you for possible danger before you've had time to think. Then you see it, just a rabbit darting across the path. Your conscious mind recognizes this, and within moments your body begins to relax. The initial surge of adrenaline subsides as higher brain regions inhibit the defensive response triggered by your amygdala. This everyday sequence reveals the exquisite dance between reflexive and conscious processes that constitutes human experience. Your autonomic systems maintain physiological homeostasis without conscious input. Your ancient defensive reflexes respond to potential threats with immediately protective actions. Your conscious recognition then contextualizes these responses, modulating them based on higher-order understanding. What makes this dance remarkable isn't that it occurs, but that it occurs so seamlessly that we rarely notice it. The different systems, evolutionary ancient and modern, automatic and deliberative, work together so harmoniously that we experience ourselves as unified agents rather than collections of semi-independent processes. This harmony represents one of the most extraordinary achievements of natural selection, the integration of multiple neural systems with different evolutionary histories into the coherent experience we call consciousness. Understanding this integration transforms how we might think about ourselves and our place in nature. Rather than seeing consciousness as something separate from or opposed to our reflexive bodily processes, we might recognize it as emerging from these processes, not replacing them but extending and contextualizing them in increasingly sophisticated ways. Dr. Cynthia Keller reflects on this perspective. What's beautiful about this understanding is that it reconnects us with the natural world. Consciousness isn't something that stands outside nature, but rather nature's most sophisticated expression of principles present throughout living systems. Principles of prediction, adaptation, and increasing integration. This reconnection with nature doesn't diminish human uniqueness but reframes it. Our distinctiveness lies not in being somehow separate from natural processes but in representing an extraordinary degree of natural complexity. Systems built upon systems, each adding new capabilities while preserving the essential functions of what came before. The startle reflex that briefly tensed your muscles on the forest path connects you with evolutionary history stretching back hundreds of millions of years. The conscious recognition that modulated this response represents a more recent evolutionary innovation. Together, they demonstrate how consciousness emerges from nature rather than standing apart from it. This perspective offers something profound, a view of human nature that honors both our ancient embodied wisdom and our more recently evolved capacity for reflective awareness. It suggests that being fully human means neither disowning our reflexive nature in favor of pure rationality nor abandoning reflective consciousness for pure instinct, but rather integrating these aspects into a more coherent whole. Perhaps most importantly, this understanding invites a deeper form of self-acceptance. If many of our thoughts, feelings, and actions emerge from processes operating outside conscious control, this suggests that the path to well-being involves not perfect conscious mastery, but rather a more harmonious relationship between conscious and automatic processes. As Dr. Xavier Ellington puts it, the goal isn't to make everything conscious, that would be inefficient and probably impossible. The goal is to develop automatic processes aligned with our conscious values, then trust these processes to operate appropriately without constant oversight. This trust doesn't mean abdicating responsibility for our actions. Rather, it means recognizing that responsibility involves both conscious reflection and the systematic training of automatic processes through consistent practice. It means understanding that character development involves not just deciding to be different, but engaging in practices that gradually reshape the automatic processes from which our actions emerge. When we pull back from touching a hot surface before consciously registering pain, when we catch a falling object without thinking, when we respond emotionally to music without analyzing its structure, in these moments, we glimpse the profound intelligence embedded in our non-conscious processes. These reflexive capabilities aren't primitive limitations to be overcome but sophisticated adaptations to be integrated with conscious awareness. The dance between reflex and reflection continues every moment of our lives, usually unnoticed but occasionally revealed in those split-second experiences where we act before we think. In these moments, we glimpse a profound truth. Consciousness doesn't create action from nothing but rather emerges from and extends processes already underway in our embodied nervous systems. This understanding doesn't diminish consciousness but rather contextualizes it within the broader tapestry of evolved intelligence that constitutes a human being. It invites us to recognize consciousness not as a sovereign ruler issuing commands to a passive body, but as an integrative process emerging from and extending the body's inherent intelligence. In the end, the real meaning behind your reflexes is this: you have never been separate from nature. Your most sophisticated thoughts and your simplest reflexes are points on a continuum of evolved intelligence, differing in complexity but united in their fundamental nature. Your consciousness doesn't stand apart from your reflexive body but emerges from it, extending, integrating, and contextualizing processes that began evolving long before humans walked the earth. The gap between catching a falling plate before you know it's falling and contemplating the nature of existence isn't a gap between two fundamentally different kinds of processes. It's a continuous spectrum of increasingly sophisticated prediction, integration, and adaptation, nature's extraordinary solution to the problem of surviving and thriving in a complex, changing world. In your reflexes, you don't encounter the limitations of being human, but rather glimpse the embodied wisdom from which your humanity itself emerges. A wisdom hundreds of millions of years in the making, expressed through every fiber of your being.